So I'm a social scientist, which is why, as someone in the lobby pointed out, this is the cleanest lab coat you've ever seen. So after years of careful, painstaking research, I can tell you with complete and utter scientific certainty that democracy is doomed to fail. Or succeed. It's definitely one of those two. So let me explain. Democracy is like an egg. It's fragile yet strong. It's filled with potential, and it's way better when you're drunk. Okay, so the science of democracy is like the science of eggs, and I'm talking nutrition. So both the body politic and the human body are incredibly complex systems. Researchers have a hard time figuring out what's going on. So do you remember back in the 90s when people read newspapers? So it seems like every other week a different story would come out about eggs. One week they're good for you, the next week they're bad for you, the next week they're good for you again. So these nutritionists seem to flip-flop more than a politician. I'm sorry, I mean they evolve. So it seems like things have more or less settled down for eggs. Everybody generally tends to agree that eggs are good for you. So you can't enjoy your next omelet unless you, for some reason, developed a distaste for orange. But with democracy, things aren't really clear yet. So to explain why, I need to talk about statistics. Marquis de Condorcet was a philosopher and mathematician who used statistics to argue for the French Revolution. What he showed mathematically is that if people in general are pretty reasonable, then you get a better decision out of a large group of people, democracy, than out of a small group, the French aristocracy. So democracy is looking pretty good. But along comes another statistician, Sir Francis Galton. And he really hated people. Galton thought that the masses, as he called them, were generally pretty dumb, and he hadn't even seen the comments section on YouTube. So, whereas the Condorcet theorem required people to be reasonable, Galton's argument was that there's nothing reasonable about a population that will chug milk, snort condoms, and eat Tide Pods. Democracy is doomed. So, Galton actually set out to try to find evidence to prove his point about how dumb people were. But instead of just hanging out on the internet, since this was 1907, he went to a county fair where he was able to get data on people's factual beliefs. So the data to some extent proved his point. People by and large hold wildly inaccurate beliefs. But the trick is that the average belief for any given question is actually incredibly accurate. It's nearly spot on. See, in statistics, errors in opposite directions tend to cancel out. So for every person who overestimates, there's another person who underestimates, and the truth is revealed. +1 for democracy. And this principle is called the wisdom of crowds, and it tells us that you can get intelligent decisions out of a room full of idiots. So there's hope for Congress. Now, this statistical principle is called the wisdom of crowds, and it's pretty incredible. So the problem with statistics, though, is that it tends to assume that data points are independent. So people are not independent. We talk to each other. We influence each other. We get correlated errors, which leads to things like herding and groupthink and mob mentality. So for a long time, people thought that in order to get the wisdom of crowds, you had to have people who are independent. So in other words, democracy works as long as we don't talk to each other. But the problem with humans is we never shut the fuck up. Democracy is doomed. But it turns out that nobody ever tried this. So we set up an experiment. We asked people factual questions, we let them talk to each other, and we watched to see what happens. So we were hoping just to show that groupthink wasn't that bad. But what we found, to our surprise, was that people actually became more accurate after talking to each other. That's 2 points for democracy. So this is pretty cool, and it earned me a dissertation, and my mother was so excited she sent me this lab coat. But the problem is, we never asked anything political. And when people get political, they get biased. Add in the fact that we tend to live in echo chambers, throw in something called the law of group polarization, and now information exchange just ends up amplifying our existing biases rather than generating collective intelligence. so democracy is doomed to fail. But it turns out nobody ever tested this either, so filled with a newfound sense of power from my swanky new lab coat, we designed another experiment. We gathered people from around the internet, we asked them some really controversial stuff, threw them into some echo chambers, and even in this worst case scenario, people still became more accurate. You're welcome, I've saved democracy. But wait, there's more, because it turns out that in our experiment we set it up so that everybody is equally connected in the network. But in real world networks, some people are more connected than others. Some people are louder than others. And our model shows that deliberation only works if everybody participates equally in the conversation. But when you let influence vary, it turns out that the effect of deliberation depends entirely on who's got the loudest megaphone. So if Bill Nye's at the front of the room, we get collective intelligence. But if Homer Simpson's got the mic, things get a little shaky. Which is why, in conclusion, I can tell you with complete certainty that democracy either works or it doesn't. But it might seem like social science has done much, but we've actually gone a long way towards figuring out what are the conditions under which democracy can work. So since I'm in favor of democracy, I will close by pointing out that what happens next in the story is up to you all. Until then, we've always got eggs.